I will be continuing along the lines of discussion of the previous speakers and speaking on particularly the matter of governance. This matter of governance has occupied our attention for some time, assuming national, regional, and international importance in all aspects of life, including, of course, politics, law, economics, and so forth. Yet, despite its common usage, its daily usage, there seems to be a lack of a precise definition that we can turn to understand what is good governance. If I were to use a quotation from another context by German philosopher Immanuel Kant, perhaps I can describe good governance in common usage simply as one of those things which is often used as a stick to beat a government with, or even the opposition with, according to Kant. But what does it really mean? And why is it important? Why is it important? What can we do? According to Transparency International, good governance is characterized as being participatory, accountable, transparent, efficient, responsive, and inclusive, respecting the rule of law. And I want to emphasize that point made by previous speakers. Respecting the rule of law and minimizing the opportunities for corruption. United Nations, the IMF, and World Bank have similar definitions for what constitutes good governance: participatory, accountable, transparent, efficient, respecting the rule of law. From any perspective, however, good governance requires action in the public interest and institutional frameworks to support these actions. It requires men and women of integrity in our leadership positions. Those entrusted with public service, our leaders, must be guided by ethics, transparency, and accountability. They must be guided by ethics, transparency, and accountability. These are the words of the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in his Anti-Corruption Day message in December last year. Closer to home, Sir Sridhar Ramphal, hailed by many as the internationalist Caribbean man, a former Secretary General of the Commonwealth, was clear that we must produce young leaders who grasp the importance of public service based on integrity. We must produce young leaders who grasp the importance of public service based on integrity. I have to say, at base in the Caribbean, we understand the need for good governance and integrity. Whether we come from rural spaces, urban spaces, we all know, as was said this morning, what is good, what is bad, what is right, and what is wrong. One only has to turn to the passionate speeches of those who led our nations into independence, whatever the colonial heritage, English, Dutch, French, or Spanish. The words of these visionary ladies and gentlemen resonate in our hearts still. They ensured that as a guiding principle, the need for recognition of integrity and good governance in our development is anchored in most of the independence constitutions of our Caribbean countries. With particular regard to integrity, as a governance professional, I've seen many definitions of integrity, but perhaps the simplest one that touches me is one attributed to Oprah Winfrey. Have you all heard of her? Oprah says very simply that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. So for our decision makers, our leaders, when we sit in our offices, in our chambers, late in the evening or early in the day, alone, with a major decision to make, with a contract to sign, a budget to approve, what do we do? Do the right thing even when no one is watching. Our present-day leaders seem to recognize the need for good governance and integrity. I note, for example, the words of our own president, His Excellency, who encourages our school children to do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. It is a good start. A look at the headlines of any regional newspaper, including today, sees declarations such as these. So yes, we do understand the need for good governance. We do understand the need for integrity. Perhaps these headlines are not seen or discussed by our leaders and citizens as often as we would like. Perhaps we do not have enough forums such as these this morning and this afternoon. How do we fulfill the words of Sridhar Ramphal to produce young leaders of integrity? How? A few years ago, a survey was conducted locally in schools by one of our colleagues, Dr. Vishnu Raghunath, who should have been here today, I think. It was called a Youth Integrity Survey. And one of the questions asked in that survey was, do you think corruption is a problem in Trinidad and Tobago? Guess what? 92% of those surveyed said yes. 92% of our young people said yes. Corruption is a problem in Trinidad and Tobago. Does that impact on us, this generation? The importance of this matter for regional and individual state development requires greater attention than just the headlines and sometimes the rhetoric which follows. In terms of our infrastructure and institutional development, multilateral funding agencies and donors place emphasis before they invest in our countries on good governance as a qualifying criteria in considering whether the investment in our small island development states, emerging economies, developing countries, whatever name fits us, they look towards this criteria of good governance. A factor in their consideration and the indicator for good governance that we have seen most referred to is Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. A very simple definition. The abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. Corruption is a facilitator of a way of life and an economy which is contrary to our value systems. The value systems we speak of, and I repeat, what is good, what is bad, what is right, and what is wrong. It is contrary to the founding philosophies of our countries. It stands in the way of sustainable economic development of our countries and a better quality of life for our people. The World Economic Forum says that corruption is the single greatest obstacle to economic and social development around the world. And it speaks to the undermining of the rule of law. Why don't we do business the clean way? It is estimated that at least 25% of the cost of procurement contracts in developing countries is added by corruption. 25% is added on the true value of the contract, at least. Is that an important asset or factor to us? Is that important to us? How many other infrastructure works can be done with that 25% or more? The CPI also has linkages with other indicators of good governance, and it is not surprising to find correlation in the rankings of countries with, for example, the Global Competitiveness Index, coincidental as it may be. I don't see any linkages with the Happiness Index, for example, but I do see sometimes with other indices. In the context of the CPI, where are we in the Caribbean on this journey towards good governance? In this journey of development through leadership with integrity. The 2014 CPI was launched 3 months ago, last December. And let's have a look at how we performed. and this is the Caribbean and Latin America. And we can say as a general statement that Caribbean countries, with the exception of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, have made little or no progress from their previous rankings. If we expand our horizon to Latin America, the pattern is repeated with countries such as Brazil and Mexico. And we have an idea why, for example, Brazil's ranking is where it is with Petrobras and the other matters which pertain to it. Chile, on the other hand, is ranked 21, and continues to be a beacon of light in the wider region. Here in the Caribbean, Barbados, home of the 3 Ws and now the 4 Ws, with a tiny population of about 286 persons, seems to have the formula for success, ranking number 15 out of 100 and perhaps 175 in 2013 and 17 in 2014. This is an excellent ranking, bearing in mind that our large neighbor next door, the largest economy in the world, perhaps the largest neighbor too, the United States, was ranked at the same number, 17. So Barbados is ranked at the same level as the United States of America in the Corruption Perception Index of 2014. Let's just take a look at the top-ranked countries in the CPI itself. And if you were to look at the rankings over the years, you would perhaps observe a certain consistency in those countries who globally rank at the top of the CPI. Let's call them the usual suspects. What are the characteristics of these usual suspects? So we see countries such as Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and so on. If we were to survey the general characteristics of those countries, we would observe one particular criteria standing out. It is the rule of law. The rule of law requirement stands out strongly. It is a sine qua non of good governance. This is a breakdown of why we think they are there. The rule of law has been described since the times of Cicero and Plato and so on. But more recently, in the case of the Trinidad Cement Limited and the Caribbean Community, the Caribbean Court of Justice made clear the meaning of the phrase when it said, the rule of law brings with it legal certainty and the protection of rights of states and individuals alike, but at the same time, it creates legal accountability. And from the previous speakers, you would have heard of the importance of accountability. The Reverend West Hall himself said that accountability is the essence of democracy, I believe so. If we were to focus for one moment on the aspect of legal certainty and rights, a legislative framework with regard to protection of rights, accountability for public funds, procurement, campaign financing, whistleblowing, and access to information seem to be the basic building blocks for this good governance criteria. Diving a little deeper, what have we done in the Caribbean about this legislative framework requirement? So we see, happily, some of our neighbors in the Caribbean have procurement legislation, integrity in public life acts, proceeds of crime acts, and so on. They have the required legislation. Here in Trinidad and Tobago, while we are pleased to say that after possibly 10 or more years in the vineyard with the procurement legislation, finally we have procurement legislation passed in the Parliament. As Afra said this morning, it's still on the books, basically. It cannot be implemented, it cannot be operationalized at this point. But in Trinidad and Tobago, we do have procurement legislation. The chairman of the EITI, Mr. Victor Hart, was here earlier, and they have published their second report. The EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, is a collaborative effort between government, companies, and civil societies to ensure, for the first time, that there's reporting, there's transparency and accountability in the management of the country's natural resources. We have with us this afternoon also Ms. Susan Francois, and last year the Financial Intelligence Unit laid its first report to the Parliament on investigations and actions involving suspicious financial transactions. On our own at Transparency, we have established our Advocacy and Legal Advice Center to provide legal assistance to victims and witnesses of corruption. Let's have a closer look at Barbados. Barbados has no procurement legislation, no integrity legislation, and no freedom of information legislation. But yet still, they rank higher than some of us who do have those legislative framework in place. They do. Is the rule of law factor then really as significant as we would like to think? Take, for example, Haiti and Guyana. They have modern procurement legislation implemented, but they rank very low. What are we seeing here, really, in this analysis? Is it, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, that good men, and I presume good women, must not obey the law too much? Or on the other side of the scale, is it that men are naturally bad, according to Machiavelli? One can argue that our island countries are not homogeneous, and therefore what applies to one may not apply to all. Is there then a good governance formula applicable to all of our countries? Or must good governance be customized for individual countries? One for Barbados, one for Trinidad, one for Guyana, one for Haiti. Is that it? I took a closer look at the top-ranked countries globally. 1 second. With Denmark as an example. And when I looked at Denmark and other countries who rank that high on the CPI, we see a clear emphasis on this matter, this issue, this phenomena called accountability. As the previous speakers before me emphasized, there's a clear emphasis on accountability. As an example, and as Mr. Murray pointed out when we launched the CPI last year, reports received, Denmark is now contemplating legislation for a public register of the beneficial or secret owners of companies. A public register of the beneficial or secret owners of companies. If you are benefiting, you should account for that benefit. This is a move that is unprecedented, and it seems to have taken root in other countries such as the UK and also Ukraine. If I were to ask West Hall or any other citizen of Barbados or a citizen of St. Vincent and the Grenadines as to the reason for their rankings, they may be at pains to give an answer. But our evaluators at the CPI will tell you that they have seen evidence of acceptance, adherence, and compliance with the rule of law. Particularly, importantly, there has also been visible action in respect of accountability for the use of public resources. The common thread of accountability applies to the highest ranked countries globally or regionally. That is the point I'm making. A strong rule of law is universally applicable and an important characteristic for those who rank at the top of the CPI. A recent survey, for example, in St. Martin, emphasized this by the University of Utrecht and by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Laws and regulations must be in place, yes. They must be in place. But they must be practiced to ensure the existence of good governance. Laws on the books are not good enough. Simply put, having looked at the top-ranked globally and regionally, whatever laws are in place, and we may say Barbados has old laws, whatever institutions have been established, they must function. They must function, and not merely in an administrative manner. So whether it is the Integrity Commission, Justice Hussain, or an anti-corruption unit, or a financial intelligence unit, or a procurement regulator here or in Jamaica, or elsewhere in the Caribbean, institutions which support good governance must be properly resourced with appropriate legal authority to function in an effective and efficient manner and take tangible, visible action where there are breaches of the law. These are the criteria that the evaluators look for. Only when persons are held accountable for appropriation and misuse of public resources can the rule of law requirement be truly satisfied. It would seem that based on our analysis, the cornerstone of good governance is the rule of law with two pillars: the protection of rights and accountability. I make the point, however, and emphasize on it, that a legislative framework on its own does not equate to the rule of law. A legislative framework, while a necessary condition, is not on its own a sufficient condition for good governance. There is ample evidence of this in our own region. I must also touch on the issue of an ethical culture, particularly in respect of a zero tolerance for corruption. But that's for next day's conference, an entire day, right? There must be a desire by those who govern and by those who are governed, that's us, for a state of sustainable good governance. There must be that desire. That's the bedrock of the ethics, where it starts. In our region, and in respect to the CPI, countries like Chile, Barbados, and now St. Vincent and the Grenadines seem to point the way. For the rest of us in the Caribbean, however, at some point, we need to stop aiming and let the arrow fly. At some point. Laws on the shelf, inadequate resources, inadequate institutional infrastructure are insufficient to satisfy the criteria for good governance. If you have any doubt, our quality of life, the economic development, and stability of our countries are at stake. A look at our headlines almost daily reflect Caribbean concern and impatience for good governance. I'm sure you remember this one. Some of you may have seen this one. And as I end, I would like to say, like Mr. Hart, I am optimistic. I'm optimistic, and I would like to think that perhaps we in the Caribbean are finally getting the point. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.